Everyone, welcome to today's happy hour. I'm Lois Beach. I am the consultancy and partnership manager for the Housing LIN, and I will be chairing today's session. And we're really excited for the session today in association with WWA. And the theme really nicely dovetails with the current all-party parliamentary group inquiry into the regeneration of outdated sheltered housing, which is sponsored by Abbey Field Society, and for which the Housing LIN, we're acting as a secretariat for that inquiry. So we're going to pop a link in the chat at some point, which is asking for a call for evidence. And essentially that inquiry is looking at not just the kind of bricks and mortar, but also the service model in sheltered and what a 21st version of sheltered housing sort of looks like. And, we're probably all very much aware that, existing sheltered housing stock is not all of it is necessarily fit for purpose or necessarily meeting the needs of existing and kind of future residents. I recently wrote a blog, in fact, which I described my visits to visiting the sheltered housing across the UK as feeling a bit like Doctor Who's companion, which is quite fitting actually for the Halloween today. So Doctor Who's companion sort of traveling back in time to the 1960s, 70s, where much hasn't been upgraded, and riders are currently at the moment really battling with what to do with existing stock, particularly in the kind of face of the current economic climate. So today's happy hour session will hopefully explore some of those challenges with our three great speakers who will give kind of slightly different angles on the subject. So first up, we've got John Wade, who is Director of Strategy at Bromford Housing Association, who will kind of give us a highlight of the kind of challenges around kind of regenerating our sheltered housing stock from a kind of regulatory and governance perspective. And then we'll be looking at some of the solutions with Mark Slater, Director of West Waddy Architecture, who will show us essentially what temporary new sheltered housing looks like, whether it's kind of newly built or remodelled. And then lastly, Amanda Hall, who is the Senior Manager of Housing Plus at Yawn Homes Newcastle, will share what a 21st century service model looks like in sheltered housing in light of their recently new branded Housing Plus service. So we'll have those three presentations, and then we'll have time for a Q&A session at the end. So please do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and I will direct those at the end of the session to the relevant speaker. So without further ado, John, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and start a presentation. Thanks, John.
Okay, hello. My name's John Wade. I'm Director of Strategy at Bromford Housing in central England, down between Birmingham down to Bristol. I used to be the MD of Bromford Support back in the day when we had a very significant supported housing part of the organisation. And I've come back to sort of looking at sheltered housing and housing for older people this year as part of some challenges that we had to some rent increases, where we applied the higher supported housing rent increase to some properties, which we got into a big debate with customers. Are they supported housing or aren't they supported housing? And that led to me reaching out to Lois and the Housing LIN and led to me ultimately being here. So I guess I'm kind of looking at it all through fresh eyes after several years away from sheltered housing. So if I have the next slide, please. So I'm a new convert to ghosts. I only just discovered it. So my wife and I are ploughing our way through the series at several episodes a night. And I hadn't thought about it, but it's obviously very apt for Halloween. Kind of, we're all just getting on with delivering services and doing the best we can. So I guess we're all like Mike, sort of oblivious to some of these things going on around us. So I was thinking about an elephant in the room, and then I thought of ghosts, because could go to the next slide. When it comes to sheltered housing, there's more than one elephant in the room. So I'm going to sort of whiz through some of those elephants or ghosts, if you will. So if we have the next slide, please. So coming back to housing for older people and working with some colleagues who are from out of sector, that's been really fascinating. We've got housing for older people, extra care housing, later living, care ready housing, assisted living, retirement housing, and sheltered housing. And people find it very difficult to understand the differences. And my mother is 84, and lost my dad a year or so ago, and talking to her and my family, members of the public find it very hard to understand what all these different terms mean and what the difference is between them. So that's kind of one of the challenges I think we face. If I could have the next slide. So for the purposes of this session, I'm using sheltered housing to mean one of those time travel things that Lois talked about. So a sort of block of apartments or flats, probably some communal space, maybe a communal meeting room, a laundry, and some kind of staff presence, probably based at the scheme some of the week, all of the week, maybe visiting, lots and lots of different service models. And certainly 10 years ago, very much seen as part of supported housing, probably still generally seen as supported housing. But as we'll come on to in a moment, when you start to get challenged as to whether a particular scheme is supported housing and what your kind of justification for that is when you're comparing it with the SDR and Welfare and Reform Act, it's not always quite as straightforward as you think it might be. So if we could have the next slide, please. So as I say, we've always thought of our sheltered housing as supported housing, but 3 organisations merged to create Bromford as it is now. So we had 3 different models of sheltered housing, and one of them gets no funding from any outside source for support. One gets a tiny amount and one gets quite a lot. We think of them all as sheltered housing, and therefore we applied the 11% rent increase to them all. But residents in a number of schemes challenged that, and it really got us digging into, and I said with colleagues new to the sector and from a kind of risk perspective, realizing that the definition of supported housing is really quite hard to meet. So the accommodation has got to be sort of special, have some special characteristics, and that the people who are housed there have to be exclusively identified as needing support. But when you then say, well, okay, define support, the Welfare Reform Act kind of goes into a circular loop and just says support includes sheltered housing. But if you're trying to establish whether the housing you're looking at is sheltered housing, it really doesn't help you at all. So we did develop a tool for the first time ever for trying to assess people applying to live in our sheltered housing, to assess whether they needed it. It wasn't an easy exercise, and we'd be very happy to share what we've arrived at, and I'd be interested to sort of compare with anything that anyone else has managed to develop, but not at all simple. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. We're very conscious that most of our older residents don't live in sheltered housing, and that as supporting people funding was reducing, we were doing a lot of work around sort of moving to a more strengths-based working, and trying to move away from sort of focusing on deficits and giving much more attention to residents' kind of gifts and skills and talents, and connecting them with each other and the community, and really a tight definition of sheltered housing that says you've got to be in need, and you can't move in as part of a thinking about the future, and services are either for people living in the scheme or not, or it can't be used by people living outside the scheme. Really didn't fit with that way of working. And we've got some great examples of schemes where things like, the classic bingo is not, there's no involvement from our staff at all. It's completely set up and run by residents, and residents who live in nearby general needs properties, right to buy properties, and even owner occupiers come and join in, and there's a real sense of community. But once you start getting into the SDR and the welfare reform rules, that kind of pushes you towards a much stricter line between who's paying for what and who can access what. So that sort of move away from a deficits way of thinking about services does kind of butt up against some of the existing kind of governance and rules around sheltered and supported housing. Next slide, please. The bricks and mortar, what's actually there, I think, and the space standards, again, referring to Lois's blog, is pretty poor. There's still quite a lot of bed sits. We've got about 150 bed sits across 2,500 properties. I noticed quite a few places now refer to them as studio flats, but nevertheless, they're bed sits. Kitchens, many of our kitchens are very, very small. There's room for a cooker and a small fridge with an ice box, but you certainly couldn't get a washing machine or a dishwasher or a tumble dryer in. Many of the things that many of us would expect to now have room for in a kitchen, and communal areas that are often very large and accessed by having to walk outside in whatever the weather to get to a space. And again, going back to my mum, every time I visit my mum and imagine that she was living in one of our many of our sheltered schemes where she wouldn't be able to do her laundry in her kitchen. She'd have to go outside with a bag full of dirty washing and walk across in the dark and hope there was no one already using the laundrette. It's not a great experience. Next slide, please. Demand, we all know you can't turn on the TV or listen to a podcast without hearing about how population is aging. There are more people living longer, birth rates reducing. So you'd expect the demand for sheltered housing to be going up and up, but we, like many others, I suspect, are not seeing that trend. And a number of the factors that I've talked about are no doubt contributing to that. Next slide, please. We know that lots of social housing is underoccupied, and Louise Drew had written a good blog saying that about 40% of that underoccupation is from households of one or two older people living in a 3 or more bed property. But people aren't going to move unless there is something appealing to move to. And, a bed sit, if you've lived in a 3-bed family home with a garden and plenty of space, is clearly not going to be very appealing. We are finding increasingly that people are moving to our sheltered housing kind of as a bit of a last resort, mainly because of its proximity to family, or they simply can't cope with stairs, but they're not full of joy when they move into their sheltered housing. So we need much more choice. If you go to the next slide, please. When we are talking to local authority partners, we find that their models and their sort of assumptions are quite dated. So whilst they're very aware of, and they've got lots of sort of bar charts and pie charts showing how the population of their local authority area is going to age, and the number of people over 60 and over 80 is going to significantly rise, when it comes to how the housing needs of that population are going to be met, they typically haven't got any kind of specific older people housing strategy, and they mostly just scale up the number of sheltered housing properties they've currently got to meet that higher need. But there's usually, they say very little about the quality of that existing provision, and even indeed whether it actually still counts as sheltered or supported housing. And they don't generally seem to use or appreciate the power that they've got through planning and Section 106 to improve what gets built on future sites. So, like, we build about 1,200 homes a year, mostly through Section 106. It's very rare that you come across a bungalow, and lots of that housing is on sites on the edge of towns, very little public transport, very few shops and other local amenities. So there's a kind of degrading existing provision in most places, and the new housing that's being built has little, if anything, to offer older people looking to downsize or think about their their later life. Next and final slide, please. So, is there an appetite for change? We've had a number of mergers over the years. We had one in something like 2005 and another one in 2008. Both of those were stock transfers. They both had sheltered housing reviews, many of the recommendations of which we've been unable to deliver in all that time. The two other organisations that merged with us more recently similarly had sheltered housing reviews, but it's like that issue that's too difficult to solve, so it keeps dropping down the list. We do lots of things around the edges. So we've built one brand new sheltered scheme in Lichfield, which is fabulous, overlooks the park. We've built 3 or 4 extra care schemes. We call them retirement living. We've combined some bed sits together to make larger flats. But really, that's probably a few score properties that we've done that to. We've got hundreds and hundreds that have got tiny kitchens, have to use communal laundries, or just generally are not very appealing to prospective new residents. We've been rolling out a digital service called Alerter Call, to supplement our kind of face-to-face coaching model. And it's great that there's the older people's housing task force and the APPG, but it does feel like sheltered housing is a bit like the sort of journey to net zero. We can do so much. So in net zero terms, we've all got plans to get to EPC-C, but how on earth we're going to get from C to A, I think is something that we all try and avoid thinking about too much. And sheltered housing feels like a similar issue. We can nibble around the edges, but there's a big challenge in the middle of the table that really, I think we feel we need lots of help with.
Well, thanks very much, John. That's really helpful to have a kind of insight from your perspective on kind of some of the challenges that I'm sure many of the people that are on the call will kind of reflect as well. And you're right around the sort of terminology, definitely trying to figure out what that means in terms from the APPG side of things. There's no fixed definition, as you say. There's quite a range of different age thresholds that gets used for sheltered housing, and trying to figure out what the right answer is. When you speak to residents, often they say actually it's more about kind of the need of people living in sheltered housing rather than the age. So yeah, that's something that we're definitely trying to tackle in the APPG. So yeah, thank you for giving that overview. And I'm going to hand over to Mark now, who will hopefully be able to unpick some of those. I know, John, you mentioned the choice and the sort of need elements of your presentations. Hopefully Mark will be able to give us some examples of actually what has been done and what is possible in terms of remodelling and rejuvenating schemes. So Mark, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Lois. So everyone can see that. Yep. So I'm Mark Slater from WA Studios. So we're multidisciplinary practice of architects, planners, and urban designers. We do a lot of work in housing, and particularly in special supported housing. And that means we come across a lot of sheltered housing schemes where clients ask us, well, what can we do with this? So I'm going to give some examples, some just common issues, which I'm sure you're all aware of. I just thought I'd do a slide of those, just so we can have them at the forefront of our minds. I was going to talk a bit about portfolio review and then run through some different options that we've come across during sort of our work, and then talk a little bit about funding considerations, which isn't my area of expertise, but I think it's pretty important when looking at sort of built environment and development. So I thought that might be useful for people to have an overview on. So these are sort of the common issues that we often come across when we're walking around existing sheltered housing schemes, and generally they're not very accessible for the people living there. They have issues with step-only access. They're not level. There's narrow corridors and door widths. Buggy storage is an interesting one because that obviously prevents fire risk sort of into the building if there's no dedicated store areas. Private external spaces, interesting as well, because you often come across quite manicured lawns at sheltered housing schemes, which no one seems to really use. So you're not really getting the most benefit out of that community in terms of external space. Fabric and services is a big one. I mean, some we've come across still have storage heaters, and then others are, still run off. Well, most will be run off gas boilers currently, and there's an issue there with ceiling heights as well in terms of getting new sort of MVHR units through. They often don't have the ceiling heights to be able to do that. And then the biggest one that John's mentioned is obviously space standards. So a lot of the bed sits we come across sort of can be 22 to 30 square meters generally, whereas a one bed flat to national space standard is 50. So some are below half of what you might expect from a accommodation. And I think that comes back to John's point about expectations of residents when they move out of a home, perhaps in later life, and it's not very attractive or appealing for them. So just to touch on portfolio review, I think it's important to view sheltered housing schemes holistically if you can. So looking across a variety, if you've got multiple schemes in one area, it's useful to look at them together, because obviously one issue with development is obviously decanting and rehousing or temporarily housing people in a different location through looking at them more as a grouping rather than individual sites. It means you can have a bit more of a plan for that. There might be economies of scale where you're doing certain remodeling aspects. Perhaps you're putting balconies externally, and that can be done across multiple sites because often the buildings themselves are can be quite standardized in terms of layout. And then sort of the opposite of that is then different solutions and can be used across different sites. So what I mean by that is you could do new build on certain ones, and while there's a demolition going on, it might be that there's some remodeling been done at another one before, which means it had a higher void rate, and that means you can then fill that whilst you're doing a new build at a different scheme. So I think that's really important. And then it's important to not just think about the buildings themselves. So when we've previously undertaken portfolio reviews, we look at accessibility of the neighborhood as well, how close you are to amenities, drop curbs, things like that can be a real barrier from the building to those local communities. It's important to look at security. It often comes up actually as really important for residents. They're not so bothered about the design, unfortunately, but more interested in security. It comes up in most things that we do. Communities obviously really important. We've been to many sheltered schemes where there's a great community environment, and they often have quite low void rates in certain schemes, but just the buildings don't really work for the people living there. So that's quite interesting. And then there's things like void rates and rental income, obviously really important when looking at sort of viability of development. So I thought I'd give sort of 4 different examples of what we've done. So this is Ashton Court, which is in Camden. So this was 36 bed sits, and we remodel it to provide 24 apartments. And the way we did this was essentially putting 3 bed sits into 2 apartments. There was also these, as you can see in this photo here, these bolt-on balconies, which were bolted onto the front of the building. And then the doors to the balconies, they used to be windows, so essentially they were cut down and made into doors to give access. And then the communal space, which is just to the right of this photo, was also rebuilt because it was we needed additional space and it didn't really work the way the layout was, and that opened up onto a landscaped courtyard, which was re-landscaped as part of the scheme as well. So this just gives you an idea of existing floor plan. So these are all the individual what would have been sort of, I guess you call them studio bed sits, whichever word you really use. They've got a very small kitchen, small bathroom and small sort of storage area, and then this would be a bedroom and living room. So you can see on the right, we've sort of taken three of those and made them into 2 to make them larger units, given them either a Juliet balcony or a balcony that they can go out onto, and that just gives them an open plan space. The reason that Ashton Court was not demolished, this front bit of the building, we were in a conservation area, and also the building itself was in quite good condition, so it seemed a waste to demolish it in that regard. But the flats are obviously compromised slightly by existing structure, so you're never going to get perfect flats that you might do with a new build in terms of layout. The thing about Ashton Court, which was interesting, is that at the rear of the site, there's a mews, and so part of the existing building was demolished, and there were 5 new mews houses put on there. So these have basements as well, and they were basically used as enabling development to fund the refurbishment. Now, not every site's obviously going to have that opportunity, and obviously if you're in central London and Camden, these are going to go for a lot of money. But even so, there might be areas where you're not going to get the same sale price as these. Perhaps it could still be useful to think about some part of enabling development, although there is obviously downsides to losing part of the land that you own. But it worked for this site. So that's just the site plan showing that. So this is the existing site plan. You can see there was some apartments to the rear that fronted onto this Camden Mews, and these were replaced with the Mews houses, and then the new communal hall was put in between with a garden, sort of re-landscaped. So that was one project that we worked on. So it's a bit of new build, a bit of remodeling, and a bit of refurbishment all at the same time, and that tends to be how these things seem to work. This is one we're currently working on. It's currently in for planning. So this is it's an existing Victorian property. So it's got 11 apartments and 1 studio. The studios is where the warden lives. So it still has a warden on site, which is quite unusual these days. Again, you've got a real sense of community at this scheme. Everyone knows each other. It's quite tight knit. To the side of the Victorian building, you've got this slightly weird 60s extension, which has quite a weird roof. I don't know why it's like that, but it is. And yeah, it's got a low void rate, but it was low density site. So if I just go to the next slide, you'll see this is the site. So there's a large garden to the rear of the site, which wasn't totally used. There were pockets that we used, but a lot of it felt like you could get the same value out of that in terms of the garden for people from a smaller area. And from a planning point of view, you'll see that there's these developments that have previously taken place in a sort of back garden environment. So from a planning point of view, we advise the client that it's a possibility to develop there when we first started. So this is sort of a 3D sort of render of what the scheme's going to look like. So there's 3 different elements to this. So we've looked at a roof extension on top of the 60s extension. So taking down the existing roof, which is slightly weird in the form, adding 3 additional apartments there. There's a rear extension as well, which runs in this bit. So that's 4 apartments, and then there's a separate block of 4 apartments as well. And the reason for splitting that really was due to a large tree and the impact of the root protection zone on there. And then a much enhanced landscaped garden will be provided, which will provide much more usable space for current and future residents. One thing that's really important with this scheme is obviously when you're working with an existing building where there's quite a close-knit community, is to really engage with the residents that are there already. And they're not happy that they're losing their garden space, but as we've gone through the process, there's an element of understanding that there's people who need this accommodation, and given that they're in a similar situation, they've been understanding of that, and they've helped us with what they want for the landscaping and how they want parking arranged at the front. It's been quite a good process. I mean, don't take me wrong, not all of them are still not happy, but it has definitely helped. Definitely having early engagement there has been really useful to the scheme. And this is just a quick site layout. So this is the existing Victorian building with the extension, and you can see this block 1 is the extension to the building, block 2 is the new build block, and then on the upper floor above block 3 as well, we've got the extension to the roof. And there's quite a lot of landscaping to the front as well, so we're going to look to they have some allotments currently in their garden, which we're going to look to relocate to the front there for the existing residents. So I thought I'd do a new build one. I mean, this is much more straightforward in some ways. So this was Cartle Main Court. It's formerly known as, this was Dunmow House, as it was formerly known, but this was a existing shelter scheme of 25 units. There were problems with Legionella, so the building had to close down. Had to be emptied. Replacing the heating system was just unviable. The maintenance costs were going through the roof, so the client decided that as it was void anyway, it wasn't worth doing a remodel on that, and they decided to demolish and rebuild. So this was provided 16 intergenerational apartments on this site. They've all got private external spaces, water space standards. There's communal courtyard gardens, and we tried to keep that sense of community with an open deck access design. So that's just a view from the road. It's in a sort of suburban location, so we couldn't go too dense on the site. Obviously, sometimes the loss of units overall can be an issue, but in this case, because the scheme was void anyway, there wasn't any rental income coming in, so it's justifiable from a viability point of view. The final scheme I'm going to show you is a bit of a combination of remodeling, new build, and repurposing. So this is Glebe Court, which is in Enfield. So this is 28 bed sits. It's got communal facilities, and there's a manager's house, which is quite interesting, which basically takes up 2 bed sits over and sort of in the middle of the scheme, which is quite interesting. So it's got many of the issues highlighted in that previous slide. So it's not level access, there's no lift. The bed sits were 22 square meters, which is obviously really, really small. And then if you look at the site plan, this can be quite typical of schemes like this, where they have a lot of landscaping and it's very low density, really. But you can't really use all this landscaping to its maximum advantage. So you end up with lawned areas that are nice to look out on, but don't necessarily need to be as big as they are. So part was a new build. So this taller block here was a new build block. And this overall provided 30 homes plus a communal space. And the homes comprise of a mix of studios and 1-bed apartments. There's 4 1-bedroom apartments and then 26 studios. They're still not very big, so there's a compromise on this site. So I flip to the next slide, you'll see what we've done. So this wall here lines through. So essentially what we've done is taken the access deck into the apartment, built another deck access walkway to the back that has lift and stair access. It means you can get a level access shower because there was a step up into the apartment, so the drainage was fairly simple. And then let's cut off the it hasn't. So we added a bay onto the front to make it slightly larger. Again, they're not big units, so this was very specific in that regard because there was an issue with the occupants. They were on income high enough that they couldn't get housing benefit, but they couldn't afford a 1-bed flat rent in that local area. So it's North London, so the rents are fairly sizable. And they also had a wider strategy regarding repurposing for single men at that housing association at that point in time. So again, this was seen as a potential, I guess, pilot for that wider strategy. So just come on to the final bit about funding considerations. So I thought I'd start with a new build. So this is from a quantity surveyor, so I had a couple I mean, the average build cost will actually vary greatly across the country. So this is a sort of average countrywide figure that doesn't include any demolition or external works figures. And obviously, you have quite variance with tenders, I'm sure most people are aware of. So it doesn't always end up like that. But that's just a guide figure. In terms of new homes, and obviously a Homes England grant that you can apply for, and there's been a change in applying for replacement homes as well. I think previously you could only apply for net additional units, only those could receive grant funding. But now you can also apply for those replacement homes, which is quite interesting development in terms of the funding side of things. There's also GLA capital funding, as I'm sure there's other local authorities that have grant available as well. So that can fund new build or the repurposing of improvement of existing homes. Now, the key thing about new build is the VAT relief. So the VAT on new build is 0%. So, and then when we come on to sort of remodeling, you can get reduced VAT if certain criteria are met. So that generally means you have to have the homes are empty for 2 years. And there's also 0 VAT currently on some retrofit upgrades. But if you look at the average build cost of sort of remodeling, now this is obviously it's difficult to give you a figure for that without knowing what the remodeling is, and this would be quite extensive. But at 1,700, you then add the 20% VAT back on. If you can't get it reduced, you're back up above the new build level. So that's one of the barriers to remodeling. And given that embodied carbon, 0 carbon sort of targets and things, it's interesting that it's that way around. I mean, I guess there's reasons for that in terms of lack of housing generally, but maybe that's something that should be considered as part of how to tackle the issues with sheltered housing. There are some grants for sort of from decarbonisation fund and home upgrade grants, but they mostly seem to be for local authorities. So you'd have to apply to local authorities, and larger housing associations have got some of a bid for some of that money as well. But again, you have to make quite strict criteria, especially for the home upgrade grant. It has to be a certain EPC level. It has to be of people on low income. And there's a couple of other criteria as well, some of which would be met in some stock and some which wouldn't. I think it's worth approaching local housing departments. So particularly, we've got experience recently of working in Surrey, where we've approached the local authority for wheelchair accessible homes, and they're more than happy to put substantial amounts of grant into that because they don't have the provision locally and they've got long waiting lists. And there's also the care and support specialised housing funding. So it's quite interesting because I don't think the GLA still seem to have this, but I can't find that it's still available nationally, which so people might be able to correct me on that if I'm wrong, but that's based on a project by project, and the more innovative your scheme is, the more likely you are to get the funding from that. And the other thing worth mentioning on remodelling is banks are a bit more conservative on lending remodelling sometimes, just because they don't know the costs sometimes aren't fixed, because you always find something that you're not expecting in an existing building. So I'd welcome more information, as people probably on this webinar that are much more qualified than me to talk about funding. So, but I thought it was useful as a start conversation, perhaps for the Q&A. So that's it, and there's some useful links and stuff when the presentation shared. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mark. That's really, really helpful to see, what some of the possibilities are around kind of remodeling or rebuilding, and particularly interesting to see some of those figures and costs associated with that. So thanks for sharing. For the sake of time, I'll quickly hand over to Amanda Hall, who's going to talk us through kind of the Housing Plus service at your home, Newcastle. So Amanda, over to you.
Hi, nice to, I was going to say nice to see you all, but I can only see 4 of you. So yeah, so Housing Plus is the name of our department, if you like. You look after all of our sheltered accommodation, but as you can see on the slide there, we have called it 4 different things. I think John went through lots of different names in his first slide there. So just to go through each one, just so you understand what who it's actually aimed at. We've got sheltered housing, which is for anybody over 55. We've got assisted living, which is anybody over 55 that has a care need. We've got community, our Housing Plus community bungalows, which are kind of either cluster bungalows or standalone bungalows, which are in different areas of the city. And then we've got our supported living schemes as well, which are aimed at people with a learning disability who have extra care needs, but actually they can be any age. So we've also got some crisis flats within that supported living as well. So the picture you can see here at the back, unfortunately wasn't taken on a sunny day like the ones in John's and Mark's presentation. It looks a bit grey, but that's Newcastle on a grey day for you. So this is Treetop Village. This is one of our shelter schemes, and it's actually it's a new scheme, so it's not been repurposed. But I thought it'd be nice to have a look at it from the outside, and you can see it looks similar to some of those ones that Mark's shown. And you know, it really is a bit of a village, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. So, but the Housing Plus offer that we give to customers, we've got Housing Plus officers in all of our schemes, except obviously our community bungalows. So all the blocks and all the cluster areas where we've got communal areas have a Housing Plus officer who customers can access throughout the day. They're there from 8 until 4, and they make contact with customers every day unless they request for that not to happen. In our assisted living schemes, we have a care provider based in all of those schemes, so they provide the care to the residents that are living in those blocks. And in the community bungalows, we have Housing Plus officers attached to a number of those bungalows, and they provide regular contact with the customers that are living there, go out to visit, and they also arrange social events and community events in areas close by, maybe like church halls, things like that, so people can get together. So for those who don't have maybe a communal lounge that they can go to, then that's kind of what we offer. I would say that the Housing Plus officers are mainly very much involved in like health and safety checks of the buildings, and also that regular contact with customers, making sure that they've got any questions that they need answering, any support, signposting, things like that. But they also do arrange social activities as well, depending on the scheme and the demands and what's available. Next slide, please. So one of the things, we've got lots of old housing stock, which lots of blocks and lots of bungalows as well. And we have remodeled a number of them, and really kind of echoing what John and Mark have said in their presentations, just the kind of things that we were looking to do is create an independent living space for people and a home that was secure, that people wanted to live in, which previously some of the blocks that we had really were very small bed sits, and really felt like actually if you wanted to do anything, you had to go out of your flat, either to the communal area or out of the blocks. Whereas some of our newer schemes, we've knocked and made flats bigger, which has allowed people to actually be able to have people around, socialise within their flat and have a home rather than a room, which is how it feels in some of our older schemes. And we've really focused on well-being, health, and reducing loneliness. So making sure that some of the blocks have got access not just to communal lounges, but small quiet spaces as well. So libraries where people can go and sit maybe with just a couple of people if they feel the communal lounge is not somewhere they want to spend time. But also for those of people that do want to socialise and spend a bit more time with the people, they can access big areas where they feel and they look welcoming. Some of our older schemes are very dingy, very dark, windows are very small. So our newer schemes have got that. Obviously space for activities that mostly happens in our communal lounges, but some of our blocks, so that Treetop Village which you saw at the beginning, we actually have cafes in them. So and we have some other businesses as well. So on the bottom floor of the Treetop Village scheme, we've got a cafe, we've got a beautician's, and there's also, I think, a card shop as well as in the end on the bottom row. So it just creates a nice place for people to live. It is like a little village, and hopefully creates a bit of a community. Another thing that was important when remodeling the schemes was looking at functional communal outside space, not just a lawn, but maybe somewhere where they can grow vegetables, somewhere where they can spend time outside in the summer, put a shed and have items in there that they can use so they can sit outside and garden furniture. Many people might have come from a 3-bedroom house to live in a property in some of our schemes, and to then have no access to garden space seems quite a big change. So it's important that we've tried to incorporate that and make it a nice place to sit and make it something that they can call their own as well. And one of the biggest things is provision for scooter storage as well. So it's been a huge thing for us to try and find the space to be able to store scooters. And we have created dedicated spaces. I think Mark mentioned it as well. And we don't want them in the corridors or in people's flats, but we do want them somewhere safe where we know that, and make sure that they're okay and they're not a fire risk. But obviously that's a lot of space that's required. So that's been remodeled into some of our newer schemes. All of our Housing Plus accommodation across all the different sites has access to our STARA, which is our 24-hour alarm and emergency response service. So all residents have access to that. So that means, if there's anything, when the Housing Plus officer's not there, or if they need access to, if there's an emergency, if they fall, then they can use that. And also updated fixtures and fittings. Some of the older schemes look really, really dated. Carpets in the hallways, older looking blinds and curtains that now I'm sure probably wouldn't be available now. So I think actually just investing in newer, brighter spaces with updated fixtures and fittings has made a huge difference. And when you go into some of our newer schemes and our remodeled schemes, the difference in them is huge. Obviously, it's massively expensive to do. And our recent, we've just recently finished a remodel of an existing block, and that's cost about £1.3 million to do it. So it's big money, but it makes it more desirable. It creates a home, and also it creates demand and moves people from maybe bigger properties that they can't afford or they're not able to manage anymore, to give them that independent living in a same area of the city, hopefully, but something which is a bit more manageable and something that they want. Can you next slide, please? So I just thought the next couple of slides are just pictures. So I just thought you might like to have a look. So this is Treetop Village. So this is inside the first one that I showed you. So you can see here, this is only one of their communal lounges. They actually have 3. So they have a communal area as you walk in, which is what you can see there. And then they have another one on each floor, because it's another 2 stories on top of that. So there's plenty of space for people to spend time together and for activities to happen. But you can see how light it is, how airy, lots of space for people to move about, and much better than some of the older schemes that we've had in the past. And most of our newly built schemes look very similar to this, and the remodeled ones again have got the same kind of aspect of you know, what this would look like. Next slide. So this is the communal area kind of into the apartments, as we call them. So rather than flats, we do try and call them apartments. So as you can see, again, lots and lots of light, really wide stairwells. And also people can, you know, if they've got a wheelchair, mobility problems, lots of space to get about. And it feels homely and looks clean and fresh, and just completely different to some of the, you know, the older schemes, which many of you will know across the country from your own stock. And then I think the next slide is the last one, and this is inside one of our apartments. This is in one of our blocks called Tishmertha, which is named after a photographer in Newcastle. And you know, you can see here, I know it's quite bright, it's a bit overexposed, but it's a really lovely big space, really big windows, which is why it's so bright, a good sized kitchen, which people can access whatever they need to do in there. But also when you come out of the kitchen, there's a really large hallway, and there's a bathroom that you can access from the hallway and from the bedroom as well. And the bedroom is very, very large as well. Many of our older schemes, the bedrooms in some cases can only fit a single bed in. Well, not many people are interested in moving into a flat which is so small. So these new apartments are, you know, much brighter and much more desirable. And I think people just find them, you know, for moving from a 3-bedroom house, a 2-bedroom property, this is much nicer to move into than something that with no storage space. And I think obviously we've styled this one, but when I've been into residence properties, they all look really good, and we get really good feedback. Before we do any of the remodeling, or when we started on the schemes, we did ask customers what they wanted, and we tried to incorporate some of those things just to make sure that we were kind of getting good feedback. But overall, it's really positive. And the schemes, this one, Treetop Village, and many of the other ones that we've got, we don't have any voids. We have healthy waiting lists, and they're really popular schemes to be in. But also as well, they're part of the community. So they're not standalone blocks. They're areas that people can use, access the cafes, and it's just a good way of integrating everybody living in that area and creating sustainable communities, which is what it's all about.
Brill. Thank you, Amanda. That's really helpful to have your Host Newcastle perspective. Yeah, sounds like, you know, I visited Treetop Villages in Walker, and yeah, it's a really great scheme. And I see we've got some questions that have come through that perhaps we can kind of touch on your learning from Treetops as well. But one in particular is around the kind of use of communal space. And actually, you know, if we're going to, you know, build new kind of sheltered housing, what is the level of communal space that we should kind of put in there? This is a question from Max Daly from Kingston Council. I wonder if, Mark, you might be best to kind of answer that question first, but perhaps, Amanda, you can give us your perspective on how well the kind of communal space is used as well at Treetops, given there's quite a lot of communal space there. So Mark, if you were, when you're kind of thinking about new builds, how much communal space are you considering? Is it something that's really important to people?
Yeah, so I think on sheltered housing, this is something we come across a lot, is existing sheltered housing, you know, these vast communal lounges which aren't really used, and they have the chairs around the edge and no one really uses them. So typically what we would do is essentially take a footprint of one of the flats and make that into a communal space, basically knocking the wall between the bedroom and the living room out. So you still have a bathroom there, and then that would have a couple of sofas in, maybe a TV and a tea point to be used. And then if it's not used, the advantage of making it the same footprint as a flat is you can then quickly turn it into an additional flat. So that's typically what we would do on sort of a modern sheltered housing scheme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant. That's really helpful. So that flexibility really is really important in case it's not necessarily used. Amanda, if you, in terms of Treetop, but how well is that communal space used? Obviously, it's quite a few. I think you mentioned 3 across three floors.
Yeah, it is. I think it is used well, actually. The ground floor, which was the picture that I showed you, that's used a lot for external kind of, we have the church will come in, I think, and do like a coffee morning, but people can come in from outside of the community for that as well. I think on the other 2 floors, obviously they're more for the residents like that are living there. They are used. When I've been in there, there's always somebody in the the communal lounges. I guess with Treetops, the lounges, because they're very open, they don't feel like a lounge that you go in and sit in. They're very open, so people walking by can, you know, converse and chat and things like that. And I think that makes a bit of a difference. I think if it's just a bit of a room, however nice it might be, I think people then don't feel they want to go in. But I totally agree, though, because it's really hard, because you could have lots of residents that don't want to be sociable in that way, and that's fine, because it's a choice, isn't it? So it's hard to be prescriptive, because you don't really know who's going to be living there, and you might get lots of people that really enjoy using the communal space, and then they move out, and then you get other people. But I would say that Treetops is well used, and they use it for different things, activities, smaller groups, and some people just like to sit there during the day and just chat to people walking past.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Sorry, did anyone want to? Mark, you didn't want to come in on that or anything? No.
Well, the only thing I was going to say is the location of it's quite important. So I'd put it right
Yeah.
next to the entrance. And then if nothing else, it's where people sit to wait for a taxi, or, you know, something like that. Or, you know, there's more chance of an interaction than sticking at the back, possibly overlooking the garden where no one, you have to make an effort to go there.
Definitely, I would completely agree with that.
Yeah. So where it is, and it being like inviting, and people just like organically draw to it. Yeah.
And we've certainly found that where the residents are the ones who kind of open it up, if you like, and invite people in, that works really well. So they get that if they run an event, the more people that come, the more viable it is, the more vibrant an event it is, and it becomes self-perpetuating.
Yeah. Slightly linked to that, we've got another question around somebody's experience of a scheme that they've got where the residents are actually quite keen to keep the older style kind of care home. They're describing them as care home looking chairs. So I guess, you know, when you walk into communal space and the chairs are all sat around the corner of the room, and we could all imagine what those look like. Amanda, this question is directed at you. I wonder whether when you were kind of making decisions around kind of, you know, the space and what it looks like, whether you were sort of consulting with residents about that. I think you mentioned a bit in your presentation around that. But yeah, how important is that consultation with residents in terms of what gets provided important, and would you make a decision against perhaps what existing residents want in light of what future residents might want?
I think it's a really good point. It's difficult, isn't it? Because you're trying to cater for lots of different people's tastes and needs. So I think we definitely did ask for feedback. I think some of the most important things is if, you know, we want to know about the people that are using the furniture, whether it's going to be comfortable or not. And actually, is it high enough? Can people get up and down off the chairs? You know, are they able to use the tables? Like, are they in the right place? I was in one of our schemes recently and noticed that there wasn't many people in the lounge, but the chairs looked really uncomfortable. In one of our older schemes. And I think it is important that you include residents and help them with that choice. I suppose the other thing is as well, like being able to show people other schemes that we've developed so they can see. And in the past, we've done that. So we've taken people along and said, well, this is what we've done here. What do you think of this? And I think that's important for kind of, you know, buy-in and also future interest in the schemes. But also as well, you don't have to change everything at once. You know, decorating can make a big difference, and if people really did want to keep some kind of furniture, then it might be, depending on what the plans are for the scheme, that was kept, if they could be kept in line with the decoration. Obviously, if it's a full-scale remodel, then actually they might look a bit strange afterwards when everything's all brand new. But I think customer consultation is really important. This is people's homes. You know, we're not coming in to say this is how it's going to be and you have to put up with it. This is about joint discussion. And obviously there will be times where a decision has to be made and it might not be exactly what people want. But I think we have to be really understanding of the reasons why they want to keep it. Is there a particular reason? Is there something we can do to meet them in the middle or compromise? I think that's really important.
Well, thank you. I'm going to focus the questions on ones that have the most votes, just for the sake of time. So we've got a question here around kind of building standards. So whether, I guess, Mark, this is something for you maybe to answer, whether kind of any of the new build or remodeling that you've done, whether they've been designed to wheelchair accessibility standards so people can remain there for as long as possible. Is that something that you're kind of designing to, your clients are kind of seeking?
Most new build sort of sheltered housing schemes that we do would be to M42 as an absolute minimum, and would generally have a percentage of M43. They wouldn't necessarily be all M43 apartments, just because of the size and the additional cost, which seems slightly counterproductive potentially in terms of future proofing. But I think that's, you know, to a certain extent where we are. And I think that this question sort of links to another one about studios and one beds as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Because the studios would be very difficult to provide sort of that home for life in. And also my fear of studios is they'll become the new bed sits in time. I think people's expectations, if you then everyone else has got a 1-bed apartment, you've got a studio, then you'll be thinking, well, why haven't I got a 1-bed apartment? And I know it's not as simple as that, because there's obviously rent levels and things to come into there. But I think you should generally be trying to do 1-bed apartments. That's generally the feedback we have from people we work with.
Yeah, I guess, and just to touch on the kind of, we do quite a lot of qualitative research at the Housing LIN, and, you know, generally the sort of what people are wanting is a minimum of 2 bedrooms even. So yeah, having 1 bedroom definitely, and that's sort of studio style living isn't necessarily what we're seeing is what's aspirational to people. And if we're thinking about kind of being inspirational, and having at least 1 bedroom and moving away from that kind of bed sit style is, I think important. Obviously there are issues around kind of affordability and things like that, but I think it's trying to be aspirational in terms of the size of I think is key. So thank you for answering that question too. We've got another question here, I guess, which is focused around kind of scooter storage. So a question around whether anybody's found a solution around kind of where people can store their scooters, whether that's, you know, trying to stop people from necessarily parking them directly outside their apartments. I know, Mark, you showed a picture of sort of a scooter being parked outside an apartment. If anyone has got any suggestions about where scooter stores need to be, how to support that?
We in the blocks that we have where we've remodeled or built, we've built specific areas for the scooters, which have got fob access doors so that customers can take them in, park them, leave them, and they're secure. They're all in one place, and where possible, as far away from the building as we can. But many of them are within the block, but they have their own kind of front door, if you like, or access. So, but it's a growing problem because more people have them than it seems than ever before. And also they cause a lot of damage when people are trying to maneuver them around the blocks. If the corridors are quite small, we've had areas that been, you know, walls have been knocked and damaged. People have tried to take them in lifts and they've damaged the lifts. So I don't think we've solved the problem. We've made it easier and we've made it safer by keeping them all in one place. But I think it's an ever-growing problem, or something that we're going to have to keep addressing. I don't think there's a perfect solution, but that's ours at the moment.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, generally on new schemes, we'd have a buggy store that's near the entrance, but I guess that doesn't solve the problem of people using them within the scheme necessarily.
No, I mean, in some larger schemes where we've got exactly that, a buggy store near the entrance, it's then can be quite a long way from the buggy store to the actual apartments.
Yeah, so a bit of a tricky one. We sort of need bigger apartments to accommodate scooter stores inside, but then obviously that comes with issues around kind of space standards and affordability as well. So it's a tricky one. I've just seen a question from Nikki Mann. Hi, Nikki, former council, that's been voted up quite highly actually, around how are kind of funding support provided in sheltered housing. I wonder whether either John or Amanda, whether you'd be happy to kind of share your views on kind of how you organisations are funding any support, I guess, they provided in sheltered housing. There might just be through the service charges, but if you could touch on that'd be really helpful. So that's been voted quite highly.
Well, so we've got a neighbourhood coach model. So it's one neighbourhood coach to about 175 customers, households, which covers across sheltered housing as well, I guess, and that's just paid for by us, so we kind of overinvest in it. And where we're adding alertical, that's service chargeable and housing benefit eligible. And I guess as well, part of what that enable coach does is try to, you know, harness the sort of power of the community and all of the things that residents and others can contribute into that. So rather than it just being about a binary, you know, resident and landlord question, it's what else is out there and how do you maximize the sense of shared skills and time and so on.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, the light's just gone off in my room again. Amanda, do you want to share a bit about how the Housing Plus service, particularly in sheltered, I guess, works in terms of the funding? Is that through kind of, you know, service model, service charges? Yeah,
it is through service charge and housing benefit eligible,
yeah.
but it still costs a lot though. You know, it still costs, and I think in our extra care shelter specifically, it really does cost a lot of money with them. But yes, it is through service charges, and I guess the main charge is for the Housing Plus officer. You know, that's the main person that, you know, we're paying for there. In our extra care shelter, then we've got a care provider there as well, which obviously puts the cost up.
Yeah. Do you find that that's something that people are quite willing to kind of pay for, that individual? Is that something, you know, just that's, is that a crucial part of your service, do you believe?
I don't think, I mean, obviously there will be people that feel it might be too much, and I guess if they're not eligible for housing benefit, then that cost may be too much, and so I totally understand that, but we don't see it as a problem. You know, residents don't kind of come back to us and say, oh, I can't live there because of that. And I think actually they really like having that service there and that support. And obviously we've got our Ostara support as well, which is the 24-hour. That is something that is paid for directly from the customer. And again, it is paid for. And I think people like the fact that that's there and people can access it, and it gives them that peace of mind and allows them to live independently without that, you know, kind of concern about what would happen at the weekend or at night if something happened and they weren't able to, you know, to call for somebody.
That's helpful. That kind of reflects what HousingLIN kind of has learned over the years around kind of that key part of sheltered housing being a person that's available. Obviously, that used to be kind of a live-in warden, but that's obviously changed. But yeah, having that access to somebody just in case we hear from residents is really, really crucial, and often sometimes a driving reason why people might want to move somewhere. Okay, we are running out a bit of time, but Mark, I thought I'd just focus one question to you around kind of whether there's any consideration is being given to people living with dementia in any of the kind of remodels or refurbishments or rebuilds that you've been involved in. Obviously, you know, we know the population of people living with dementia increasing. Wonder if you could touch on any insight into that.
Yeah, so yes, there is in terms of contrast and sort of the design aspects of it. I think where it gets more complicated is where the care needs go above and beyond that. So that's when it's more tricky. But in terms of the design, then you could, you know, much of the sort of design issues can be applicable across any housing development really, and don't need to be specialist, but it's that care that tends to mean that people have to move into sort of a more where care is provided under extra care scheme.
Would you sort of, if you were thinking, you know, with this sort of blanket, yes, you definitely would integrate dementia friendly design across sheltered housing? Oh, that's all right. Sorry, just getting interrupted. What was I saying? So is it something that you were kind of, you know, when you're thinking about when you're working with clients to remodel or repurpose, are you thinking actually, we need to do this as a kind of standard across all kind of design principles, or does it kind of depend on different circumstances?
No, I think it can be applied everywhere, really. I mean, whether it is or not,
Yeah,
in
or not.
schemes is different. But yeah, we certainly try to apply the core principles across every scheme.
Yeah. Brill. Okay, I appreciate we've probably gone a bit over time. Are there any questions that any of the speakers have seen come into the chat box that you guys particularly really want to get under the skin of or answer now? If not, we are kind of running a bit over time, so I'm happy to kind of close. But I know we've got a few people have left us already. But do jump in if not.
I just wanted to just add on to what you were just saying, Mark, about the dementia friendly. What we've done in one of our schemes is we've painted each level a different colour, so that like quite a bright colour, so residents can like find where they're going and remember what floor they're on, or it just kind of helps guide them. But also we've got areas where we've got history of Newcastle and stuff that they can sit with music and things like that, and we've done that in one of our blocks, and it's been really welcomed, and customers really really interacted with that, and we found it really successful. So I think some things can be done, and it does work well.
Brill, thank you. And just to sort of mention about the APPG that we're running, that's looking at the regeneration of outdated sheltered housing. We're really interested in people kind of sending us examples, or where you've kind of things that you think have worked well, whether that's about the bricks and mortar or the service model. We'll be looking at kind of Romford's neighbourhood coach approach in direct contrast to where people have a more dedicated service scheme manager. But we're particularly interested in if any examples of people that have repurposed sheltered housing schemes for another reason. So we've got an example of tourist housing they're presenting at our next session, where they've kind of looked at changing the use of a sheltered housing scheme to refuge, safe accommodation. So quite keen to hear about that, as it's not something that we hear a lot about. So if anyone's got any examples of repurposing sheltered housing, that'd be really, really fab. I think Sally's put a comment in the chat around how you can submit evidence to the APPG. If no one's got any kind of further things they want to add, just want to say thank you very much to our speakers. Thanks everyone for joining us today. The slides will be available, and the recording will be available this week or next week. But yeah, really, really appreciate taking the time. And yeah, thanks. Have a lovely evening. I hope you all go trick or treating.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.